Alright, so I just want to go over some of the basic elements of the freeform section of Fusion. It's quite different to other modeling we've done, so you should have experience using SolidWorks at least from first year, but now we are teaching Fusion in first year and advanced CAD. So hopefully going through some of these things will be able to sort of speed you up. And you can use some of these in your droid modeling if you think it's useful or relevant. So the way this freeform workspace works, first you just simply enter it by creating a form in solid. It doesn't show up in surfaces, so under solids, and whenever you create a new form, it does add in a feature in the timeline. But it is almost like a whole nother program essentially within Fusion. The way it all works is quite different. So we've got all these options of objects we can start with, and we'll go through them and show how we can play around modifying them. Maybe the most basic one is a box. It asks where you want to put the box. Generally, you always want to start something from the origin, but we'll find that restraints and dimensions don't really play that relevantly in freeform modeling. So, we can say we want it to be 100 by 100, hit enter, and it gives us our box, although that's only come up by 50. So we want to actually have a better look at all the controls we've got that show up here. So if we just go a random shape and size, we now get the option to have some proper control over it. So as you can see, it's a box shape, but it's rounded out. And the way this works, after creating it, we can have a look, is Fusion is creating all these faces. And this is pretty much how the epitome of like what freeform is, right? So we get these faces, and what it tries to do is blend them together. It's called like T-spline modeling. And instead of making a face that connects with a surface, an edge, and all that, it just tries to blend all these edges in nicely. As you can see, the curvature of the surface is really good and smooth. So I'm going to switch between the box mode, which is sort of what Fusion sees and calculates everything off, and then the smooth display is the actual outcome of those shapes when it's smoothed out and calculated using these T-spline surfaces. You can also use the control frame display, which shows both of these, and this might be actually a good way to show it off. For people on Windows, you can use Alt 1, 2, and 3 to swap between the modes. So Alt 1 gives us just the basic box. Alt 2 gives us both, so we can see the basic box and then how that works to blend it in. And then Alt 3 is just the smooth mode. So looking at the second view option, which shows both, we can see that we've got, straight lines out here, but they blend in. So if we come into Edit Form, this allows us to pick these faces and to manipulate them. And you can see it even highlights the inner one there. So this is actually probably a really good way to show you all. You can modify them by pushing and pulling faces. So as we can see that the box form has come up across here like that, and it's now smoothing it differently because obviously the face is in another location. So we can start to understand that by pushing and pulling and changing this out of box form, it's smoothing the shapes out differently, and obviously giving us a really organic shape that's blended between all of these. So going back, there is the option to make what's called creased edges, and that ensures that these lines remain sharp. So I'll just cancel that. So creasing edges is really important, especially when it comes to making a base form. So when I turn that on, you can see it pulls the box all the way to that point there, because this edge and this edge are creased now. If we look at it, we can see that it's got a darker line, or at least it should. This is just a bit of a graphics glitch on my computer, but this line should be coming up darker. And we can see it here when I swap between the modes. It does come in darker and a bit thicker sometimes. Unfortunately, yeah, it does glitch up a bit. And what that means is that this edge is creased, and we can see it's bringing it across to the top. If I go ahead and crease every edge on this, on the outside, you'll see that it just goes straight to the original box shape. So come across and get all of these. So like, it's really good to know and see how the corners work. By leaving one uncreased, it still blends it across these faces in this direction, but when you click it, it creases it and it makes sure this points up in the top. So you can get some really good results by creasing edges. You know, if you want some interesting and smooth transitions but still want to control it, obviously you can use the crease. I find generally early on in the modeling stage of freeform modeling, I'll use creases more, just because we find that it does get hard to control all these surfaces and edges and everything, and trying to create fillets using freeform surfaces can get a bit out of control, because there's nothing locking it all in place strictly. We don't have dimensions exactly, we're not restraining them and all these things. So I generally try to avoid making fillets like this. So if you come out of the Freeform Workspace, what it does is it creates a solid body if it's sealed. And what I'll do then is go in and add a fillet to fill it in that shape. So that's how you can get nice fillets going, because trying to add those fillets in this point by having them uncreased and adding in geometry to make those corners tighter gets really complicated. So if you're going for sharp edges that are going to be filled later, always try and do the fillets in the solid modeling once you exit the freeform. But as we can see here, it's still this box shape, and you might be able to see the crease lines here. It's still the same box shape, it's just working with creased edges, and it still manipulates in the same sort of way. We can, you know, pull this out, and what it's going to do is it keeps the crease and just pulls that top part of the shape out. And the reason, you know, it's out here and this starts to, you know, we didn't change this line, it's still vertical here, but what it's doing is blending these surfaces as well as it can. So we get obviously really nice surface geometry. If we pull in, say, like the middle spot, we can start to get some really good contours. So we'll just, you know, even this top one is the one we want to manipulate, so we pull it back in like that, and we can see that the surface starts to contour, because now it's calculating from out here to in here to here, so it's blending it smoothly across there. The top transitions from this face to this face, so it's also blending it across there. It's really complex, right? How Fusion and other programs that use T-spline modeling calculate everything. It is really complex, so we want to just be able to understand what we can do to simplify it and get the shapes we want properly. So experimentation in this type of modeling is good, but we just want to make sure, you know, if we want this bottom section to come up and contour like we've done the top section, we can have a look in the box mode, see that these are on the bottom, and make sure to only move these. We can select this and move it up, but this is going to start affecting this area up here, and we don't want to do that. We just want to make sure we select the bottom one. So sometimes it can be really useful just looking in the box mode and seeing where things are and how we want to move them. So we push that up, this stays mostly the same, and now we've got this going on. We finish the form, and you know, we can come in and add that fillet back in. It should update as well. Oh, I dragged that too far. It should update as well if you've got a fillet in this like that, and you can go back in your timeline and pull some shapes out and modify it some more. That should, yeah, it'll run the fillet and hopefully it'll be successful. So that's just, you know, one way of going about things. If you know you've got a type of shape you want, you can play around with it and try and create it. Other ways to use, I'm just going to hit finish because it puts an outline there. I'll just delete it. Other ways you can do is starting off with a plane. So this is essentially just one face of, or one side, sorry, of our box. So what we can do is just punch in some numbers to get it nice and even. Now, one of the things is really good is to add symmetry to our geometry, and this allows us to make sure that whatever happens on one side also happens on the other. As you can see, if I do that, it lights up the opposite one and it moves like that. Same thing for selecting points. So when you're moving points around, it just moves one, obviously, corner of that, and allows you to get those complex shapes going on really well. And yeah, like the smooth transitions are really excellent for some of this modeling we're going to be doing. But we do want to be careful that we don't overcomplicate our geometry. So what I mean by that is we currently have 4 faces, right? We can actually go in and remove faces. So if we get rid of that, now all the control we have is, you know, we don't have a separate dividing line in the middle that we can edit. So when we pull that down, it edits from all the way across as opposed to going from halfway and curving it. If I go back, we can look at creating geometry that has more points to start with. So by dragging this slider or changing the settings here, we can see how many length faces we have and how many width faces we have. You generally want to make sure that you've got an even number if you're working with symmetry, so you can get the split down the middle. It's generally just a better way of doing it. And we can see here now when we move this, what's going to happen is it's going to be a lot of a tighter radius because we've got flat, flat, and then it curves, as opposed to removing all of these and having it go from a point here to a curve down here. So you get a lot more control over your form when you do this, but it adds a lot of complexity to it. So if you want to change large aspects of it, then you have to select multiple faces and blend multiple areas. So when you have to push and pull multiple faces at a time, it can be really easy to start getting geometry and shapes you don't want when you pull things around and it starts to look uneven like that. When you have a look in the form, you no longer have straight edges along here. This blends in really weirdly, and it starts to look like a lot of the design is sort of, well, unintentional, and we don't want that. We want to be very purposeful in the way we design. So, you know, adding creases can help to make things quite solid and look purposeful, like I keep saying, just because we want to make sure we know what we're modeling. And having all this weird complexity, having different, like a different length here to here, means that that face is going to be blending in and out. And generally, you'd probably want to keep things relatively constrained. I see it a lot in advanced CAD where we've got super complex surfaces going on and there's a lot of points that are out of whack, and sometimes you can actually break the geometry by pulling things too far over. It won't work properly. So when you do something like that and it's overlapping and try and rebuild it into a surface, it won't work. It'll tell you it's failed. So you have to return and fix the areas where it intersects, and it will highlight them and tell you what's wrong. But we want to go and do it to a plan, essentially. Like all CAD modeling starts with a sketch, right? We should always know what we're going to model up in CAD. We should never just start modeling shapes, unless of course we're just exploring with features. But we want to add control and have that control where we need it. So something like this, right? We can see that if we look at our box form, we've got these points really high up here, and what it's doing is blending it quite, obviously it blends it well, but it's nowhere near the points where we want it. So we can go about bringing this down by adding in another line here and making it close to this one. So what I mean by that is you don't want to try, and if you want this point to be a lot lower, like similar to the one on the edge, you don't want to just always grab it and pull it low, because now we can see this is much lower than here. We want to try and make everything as even as possible in both workspaces, in like the box mode and the smooth mode. So what we can look at doing is inserting an edge, and that's just going to give us another edge here, but somewhere in between, so it gives us more control of this area of the model. So you can come through and click, or you could even double click. So when you double click a line, it picks all the lines that are tangent to it. And we can see now what it's trying to do. It gives us this number that's anywhere between 0 and 1. And that's just going to pick where it puts this line in along this face. So somewhere around there in the middle is fine. And as we press it, we can see the surface tightens up a bit. And we go to our box mode, and we can see that it's still, you know, relatively the same, but we've got this line in between it now. So what we can actually do then, if we want to make this come down lower, is change how soon this surface comes down vertically. So by changing this down like that, what it's going to do, instead of immediately blending this edge up, it's going to blend it outwards and then up. So by doing that, we can start to get something like that. And then if we want it to be sharper down low, we can actually insert an edge right over here and right over here, and that's going to control the way this blends in. Because we got symmetry turned on, we only have to do it on one. So if we type in, or if we go to insert edge, we can do that. But we also want to look at maybe doing on both sides of this, so we can control both of these at once. So if I just go 0.5 right in the middle, that might take a second. You can see there, it's blending it a lot further. So instead of going all the way from here to here, it's going from here to halfway, and then from halfway to the bottom. And that already brings it almost right down to where we want it. We can control that again by, let's just bring that up a little. We can control that even more by now pulling down these. So if we want it to be more of a scoop instead of rising up, we can just pull these down and it starts to flatten it out. You want to be careful though when you're modifying things like this. Obviously from this point of view, this is higher than this. If we pull it down to a point where it's lower, like somewhere here, right? It doesn't look horrible, but if we have a look in the view mode in the box, we can see that it's actually going down then up. And when you do come in and look, you can see that. So it's really important to try and not break sort of tangency or normal with these. We want anything here where we're blending across, we want it to be smooth. We can control that by either bringing down this until it looks pretty flat. There's another way though, we can use the scale feature, and that allows us to pull objects flat or to increase the proportion. So I don't know if it's actually called scale or proportion or whatever it is, but we can select two of these faces and pull this in, and it's going to allow us to flatten it out. It does freak out when that number trips at 0. So you just drag it down very close to 0 and it'll look pretty normal. And there you can see it comes in and transitions back up really smoothly. We can see that this, however, is still pulling it down past here, even though this is flat. So this is just because there's not enough information here to blend in. We can do the same sort of thing by inserting an edge. We just want to make sure we're doing it on a single side because it is going to be mirrored. And when we do that, it does tighten it up a little, but we want to ensure that this line is horizontal to that. You might think that we want to pull this one up, but again, that's going to be the same sort of problem we had before. When we drag this up, or both of them, to flatten that, it's going to push that out. So we just want to always make sure we're moving all we have to and nothing else. So doing that helps pull that up a little bit more to allow us to control that. So, you know, but we can see now that we've added all this complexity here, but we've pushed all these lines through. So like now coming back and modifying this, we have to select multiple faces and it can start to get really out of whack. So you've got to be really careful where you're adding in detail. Generally, you also want to make sure your edges go all the way to the other side. Like we could actually come in here and delete all these parts of the line we don't want. But that then doesn't give us a lot of control of how this blends in. And Fusion generally doesn't like making surfaces or faces that have multiple edges. So we want all of our faces to have 1, 2, 3, 4 edges. This one at the moment has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And when you do that, the shapes start to blend together quite weirdly, and you lose that really nice surface transition. Sometimes it can be easier to see by using the zebra analysis. Like obviously it's still good because it's a very large blend, but when everything's all tight and neat, you want to have, you know, to me even these already look better, these surface transitions, and you can turn on high quality, which sometimes takes a second, but you can see that the blending of these areas is really smooth and it works out really well. So you generally want to have your lines going all the way from one side to the other, or what they call a loop. So this loops all the way around, and when it's, you know, a solid, it actually, you know, creates a full loop. So we can do that. If I just bring in a plane again, we can actually start to create a, well, like a 3D form out of this in another way. So we can pull out edges. So generally, if we just pull the edge, it just does that. But if we want to add more faces in, we can hold in the Alt key, and that allows us to pull out another edge, which brings out another set of faces. And you can go through and, you know, create forms or whatever you want, depending on how far you pull them out in certain directions. So if we make it really small, then add another one, that's going to put a really little tight radius in there. You know, and you can just pull them out in whatever direction you want and start to get crazy complex forms. And even if you bring it close like that, you know, you can start to make this a whole solid body and fill it out that way. So there is a lot of options for how you want to go about creating your shapes. So yeah, like, I hope you can see why I would suggest, that you model with a bit of purpose, because it's really easy to make things that are unnecessary complex and actually come up looking just messy. One thing we want to do here, so we probably want to use the merge edge command, and what this allows us to do is select an edge here and here, select our second set of edges like that, and that's going to bring them together. So we'll start looking at some of the other ways we can do that in a minute, but you know, you can see that it's actually added that symmetry line. So the way symmetry works is really good. It just goes straight for the middle plane if you've set it up that way, and anything you add will replicate, and just by merging that and make sure it's all continuing on. So that's just the box and the plane. You can go for cylinders if you want to start with something, well, cylindrical and round. I generally find that on a cylinder, you mostly want them to start off flat and then you can add them in. So I remove all the middle ones and start off with the base. So you can do things like, this allows us to scale proportionally in two directions. So like we looked at the way of flattening it, we can do that, or we can make it grow. By scaling it out, you can start to get some really interesting sort of radial forms, if I can do that properly. And then we drag this out vertically. We can drag one in scaled as well. So what it does is it pulls it straight in, go straight up, go straight out. So we can start to get some really interesting shapes going on like that. If we're looking at, I don't know, modeling up some weird obscure type of wheel or track system, whatever it might be. And well, yeah, I think you can get the gist of that. So instead of actually sketching something from the side and then revolving it, we can just make sure we do things like that. There is options to set circular symmetry. So we can select faces from here, and it comes up with, like, even just selecting one, what it does is it comes up with possible symmetries. So two-sided symmetry, we can see it's trying to put a line down through there. If we go four-sided, it now splits it up into four. So whatever happens here is going to happen here and here and here. Or we could even go eight-sided and it puts in more lines. So this will allow us to keep that symmetry going by pulling it out. We can even add things like twist into it. Yeah, so radial symmetry can be really interesting for getting complex patterns going. One of the things to note is when you've got this turned on, if I extrude out by selecting that, it doesn't join them together. The way that anything with symmetry works is you need to select, even though it's got this highlighted yellow, you need to select the next edge over, and then it understands that it wants you to join them. So then when I pull it out, it joins all the rest of them together, as opposed to having one selected and then it just expands it out on its own like that, which is, you know, sometimes you want to do that, sometimes you don't. So yeah, that's kind of how you can play around with the cylindrical tool, or the cylinder, whatever it calls it. One other really sort of interesting thing in how this works to calculate shapes is the difference between a quad ball and a sphere. So what I'll do is select one of these and move it over. So right here we have, well, two ball shapes, right? Except we can see that the faces on them are quite different. So a sphere is kind of how you would assume a conventional sphere is modeled up. It uses a set of faces along an edge that's essentially revolved around. And we can see that we get these faces tighter in here as it goes. Over here on the quad ball, we've actually got just a box. You know, four sides, faces. And they're just edited slightly to bring all these edges out a bit. And the way it blends them together ends up making a pure sort of sphere shape. So if we do put a zebra analysis on both of them, we can see the quad ball has a tiny bit of deflection around the edges, but that's not really a problem. You're very unlikely to notice anything like that. And the reason is, generally you don't just end up with a ball. If you end up with a complete sphere shape, I would rather recommend you use the solid modeling workspace for that. But if we're talking about editing these shapes to, you know, create freeform objects, when we pull that out, we can get something like that, right? And it's an elongated sphere. To do this, we have to select all of these, and obviously it comes out differently because it's constructed differently. It's not done evenly. So if we want to pull 4 faces out from that side, it does that as well, and it gives us this kind of shape. Whereas a quad ball gives us this a lot more sort of standard control. It's got the even amount of faces on it. And generally you want to go with a quad ball, especially because it doesn't come to a point. We want to avoid things that end in points. We want things to end in square faces as much as possible. So even if we do something like delete these, if we go in and we delete these front faces, we see that it opens up like that. And if we come through and delete these faces, it doesn't really change too much, but there's, for the same sort of shape, we get a lot more information here. It ends in a point. This one has a lot less faces. It's easier to manage. And so if we edit these and pull them out, we can see we're still achieving that rounded shape. This can work, but for some things where you actually want really good control, it can just be super useful to go with the quad ball instead. I would generally recommend the quad ball because what you can actually do is really easily blend this into a cylinder you've created, whereas this is a lot more complex. So when we have a cylinder such as this, and we can punch in numbers here to make it all accurate in terms of rotation. When we have a cylinder, oops, we find that our lines actually match up. So generally you keep your cylinders to 8 sides, keep them nice and simple. And what we can do is actually, even if we scale that up slightly as well, we can see that we've got those sides matching up nicely with that. It does work over here as well, but it just isn't the best way. I find that using a sphere tends to make it a lot trickier to control the end face. You can't go in and add information really easy. So what we'll do is I'll move these further back and we'll look at using a loft to join these all together. So I'll just drag that back there. Drag that back there. So if this will let me play, yep. Okay, so when I say loft, I mean the bridge command. And well, it's a loft, right? I would call it a loft just about every time, but it bridges the surfaces together. So we can come through and select everything here, or we can use the double click. So on side 2, what I'm going to do is just double click, and we just want to make sure that preview's turned on, and we can see that it's going to put in 1, 2, 3 sets of faces because we've got 3 set, and it's going to bridge them together. So we turn that on and it bridges it, and it comes up quite nice. We can do the same here, double click there. Even if when you double click on a different section, it already moves to side 2 and does that, and it comes up looking pretty much the same. But we can see here, this is where we start to appreciate the quad ball. So if we want to add in more detail on this side, right? So we've got the box set up like this, right? If we want to add in detail that runs all the way along, the quad ball is going to work really well. So by inserting an edge down here, we can do that, and that allows us to contour this side profile quite well. So we can flatten that out or do whatever we want. In CAD class, we're working on game controllers where that's super useful. On this, however, if we double click to select the loop, it only goes from here to here because we don't have the, it doesn't continue, it all ends up in a point. So when we add in another line here, you can already see it's losing a lot of its roundness. Like, it does happen over here as well, but you can control it a lot easier. This is losing its roundness. If we click through, oops. And want to bring it in a bit, or, you know, what were we playing with last time up here? It starts to now pinch this section, and we can see our geometry is getting really complex. It's pushed it in past that point, so then you have to go in and edit here and bring that in to make sure there's like a really smooth transition between there and there. And it really starts to get quite complicated to try and manipulate a sphere object in the same way as a quad ball. And as if we turn on our zebra analysis, we can see that this gets quite wobbly up in here. Our front point's now really weird because there's not instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, there's now 9, so it doesn't really blend that in as well, whereas the front of this one's still really nice. So trying to understand the whole quad ball thing can be a bit complex. Just use the quad balls. I wouldn't use a sphere in any case. The quad ball's a lot easier to manipulate and a bit smarter when using T-splines. We've got things like a torus, which is, well, a donut, I guess, which just allows you to do a section in a ring. This does work well if you're modeling something up like, what have we modeled up before, like a steering wheel or something. Generally works really well, or, you know, any type of ringed shape. Then you've got the pipe command, which can be really awesome and useful. This actually requires a path. So you can do the pipe command in two ways. You can sketch something in the standard modeling workspace. So I'm just going to go ahead and do something like that. And what I'll actually do is, when you're editing the sketch, you can use the move command to actually pull it out into 3 dimensions as well. So we'll do something like that. So we've got a 3-dimensional sketch. And what that'll do is allow us to create a pipe similar to a sweep, right? So in Fusion, we've got sweep. We've actually solid modeling actually has its own pipe command. So it's just a sweep with a circular, square, or triangular profile, which is super good. But what we can do is, in freeform modeling, we can create a pipe across here, and what you'll see is, if I just change that diameter up to about 40, it creates all these faces across here, and sometimes you got to go around and play around with the tolerances or the segments. So we want fewer segments. We can have a look at the display to see, yeah, it's going to make a really nice path along that. Play around with the tolerances, all these kind of things, right? So if we want a lot of segments, you can do that. You'd probably never do something with that many segments. You can change how it ends. So if you want to make it a spike or square, so kind of like a little mini quad ball, all these different things, right? And then what that does is allow you to come in and modify a piped shape. So if you want to pipe something in the standard modeling, but you find you want a bit more of an advanced geometry to it, I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete that face. Yeah, if you want to make it like oblong shaped or something like that, or oval shaped, whatever you call it for a round sphere thing. And then, you know, pull that. It really needs to stop. Oh, because it kept the other end. That's my bad. I don't use this command that often. It's, you know, pretty specific. But you might find that one of your designs is meant to have some looping things around. If we want to make things look like natural cables or rope, I find this is really useful. But then, you know, we can do things like that and start to create some really interesting sort of sculptural shapes using this command. Or whatever we want, like, you know, so now because we've distorted the actual piping itself, it's not the cross-section changes in different areas and it's all blended together. Modeling something like this up in the standard modeling is going to be quite difficult, so we can do it in that way. And if we want something that changes and sweeps along a path, we can just make sure we use the pipe command for that. We've also got other things that can reference sketches. So if I turn the sketch back on, we've got Revolves. So you can select that, and when you pick an axis, you can, I don't know, pick that and it'll revolve it around that. So that's another good way of doing the cylindrical shapes. You can put on that circular symmetry again. So that's really cool. Sweeps, we can do lofts between sketches, so similar to the bridge, but between sketches and not faces, or even just basic extrudes. So we can select it and just extrude it upwards, which is great for starting off a form. So if you sketch something that's meant to be the rough sort of shape and the dimensions are pretty close, then you can go ahead and actually model the shape around the sketch or whatever you have. And it can be really annoying when you select the wrong one, and kind of create something like that. And then go in and run that merge edge command. Oops, edge group 2. And you do that and it merges those in. What we can do though, we can see that our sections aren't really smooth, like these are close towards there or something like that. If we've got something like this and we want to smooth out the transition so it blends together like completely, one of the little cheat ways I found is just delete the inside geometry like that. What that is going to do is blend it together so it's round. If you don't want it round, you can then actually come in and insert an edge halfway. And that's going to put it halfway across the whole thing, so all the transitions are really even. Oops. Insert edge. And sometimes you actually have to type in negative. It decides which way the edge is going to go, so you might have to type in the negative number. But as we can see here, it's made it really well controlled, and it goes from, you know, this line up at top to over here and blends that in. If we look in the sort of double mode, we can see how it's blending those together. And then when we get rid of that, we know it's blending it straight from there to down there. And smooths it out a lot more, but you really want to have that sort of control. And, you know, don't forget that if some edges are really important and need to be there, you can crease them to get some sharp creases going on. What else is there in Freeform? There is, so that's mainly like the base sort of forms you can create. We can look at all the ways of modifying our shapes. So what I'm going to do is just create a plane that we can try and find examples for all the features. So if I can select the base plane there, I'm going to create this with a bit of complexity, which is fine. So we've got symmetry in these two ways. I might just actually turn that off. So obviously this is flat. Looking through here, we've got insert edge, we know what that is. Edit form, super useful. Subdivide. What this allows us to do is it divides a face or a set of faces into smaller faces. So if you've got a big flat thing and you don't want to insert the edges, you can subdivide it. To increase the selection of faces, you have to hold in control, because it won't let you just click another one, so you got to hold in control. But again, this brings in that problem of these faces don't connect out to anything, so they're going to start to blur and get really weird transitions over time. So I generally avoid using Subdivide. Insert point can be really useful. If you've got something where you want to actually specifically have different line paths through it and you don't want just a straight edge, you can do something like that, and that'll allow that blended sort of surface which has the wobbliness to it. You know, sometimes you want that, and sometimes just inserting things like that is really important. You can use it to change how the edges of your shape works. So if we go insert point from down here to here and delete that outside edge, it does round it out. However, we can see it is warped slightly. You got to be really careful with how these work. I'm not a big fan of playing around with the edges like this. I would much rather try and get it as straight as possible and then fillet it later. But that is another use of that. And if there's an area on your thing where some reason you've modeled it up, and you know, we can look at this, right? And there's all these sections here where you've got faces that stretch out, and they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides. You can repair these by using insert point, by just clicking from one to another and going OK, and that's going to straighten that out a bit once we get that next one in. So repeat that. We can click through here, and here, and that straightens that out. Insert point for me is definitely more of a repair and control tool. If things start to look complicated, you can delete some faces out and just restructure them. Merge edge, we looked at that, at bringing two edges together. Bridge, we looked at that. Fill hole, I generally try to avoid using this command just because if I delete this shape, and what I'll do is extrude that out. I generally try to avoid using this. It'll probably work fine because this is a 8-sided shape. It's nice and even, but we can look at the different ways it does it. So just by double clicking, that selects the loop. And we can see here, like the reduced star option kind of tries to turn it into that quad ball like shape, but it doesn't link them together properly. Fill star, what that simply does is makes a 8-sided star, which is really bad, and collapse brings it together like a sphere would, and we saw how that can cause problems when it's all in a point. So for me, what I would probably do is create a bridge from here to here, and then we have to weld in these edges. So this will be a really good way. I can show you the Weld Vertices command. So to fix this up, and this is a good case of using bridge as well, what we want to do is select our sides. Sometimes we find that this point might be in the wrong area, so we can just click through and modify it. I think you'll all remember when you try and model a loft up in SolidWorks and it twists up really weirdly. Although what we can see here is that we're going to have these 3 faces along the length, and because we've only got 2 on the side, we want to make sure we select 2, and we're just going to hit OK and give that a second. All right, so we can see it's gone kind of weird. The problem is, even though these are in the same spot, these edges didn't weld together. And if I go ahead and edit the form by bringing that in, we can see that it's not actually connected. So obviously this is a huge problem in that there's a gap. It's trying to blend these together, but it can't because they're not touching. So what we have to do is go in and use the Weld Vertices command. And this kind of simple, there to there, and it joins them together. You can do it again in the same command and there to there. So now we can see that this is blended together really nicely. It just goes from here, it can blend all the way across. From here, it can blend all the way across. So that's how I would go about it. There are other ways. The thing with Fusion and Freeform is that there's probably 10 different ways to do every single thing. But we want to look at it as how can we do this in a way that uses the simplest amount of faces and commands. We don't want to overcomplicate everything. We try and want to make it as simple as possible. Going back, if I can go all the way back, so that's kind of how I would go about filling holes. I would avoid using that tool. Erase and fill, I mean, I don't think that one's very useful at all anyway. Weld Vertices, Unweld edges, so there might be times where you want to separate some edges, so we can select things like that, and it does this same kind of pinchy thing where we can grab it and pull it up. Sometimes this can be useful if you're trying to create like a vent on a surface. Like when I was modeling up a motorbike helmet for CAD, we found that like unwelding an edge can actually be a useful way of doing it, but generally not that useful. Then we get back into crease and uncrease, super useful commands. So again, just to show we've got that, and if we come through with crease, what it's going to do is pull it up to where it actually matches that box shaped line. And I can't stress enough how important it is to use the crease command to create the geometry first and then start to smooth things out around it. Obviously, along with crease, we have uncrease, which allows you to undo that. And again, you can understand how useful that'll be. So creasing things isn't a permanent thing. You can uncrease at any time. Bevel Edge. I actually prefer, instead of beveling an edge, I prefer to use Insert Edge and move it close, because what bevel does, it actually, sorry, that's still creased. So what we'll do is uncrease. What Bevel Edge does is it puts an edge somewhere on both sides of it, of your line, and it deletes the original line. So if we push this up here, we can see it's going to put a line here and a line there, and it's going to make that much tighter. Let me just mute that. And so we get a much tighter radius that's quite smooth. We can do this kind of thing towards the end of our modeling. So once you've got everything set, you can then go ahead and uncrease those creased edges and put a bevel on them. But I still prefer, instead of doing that, I would much rather use the Insert Edge command on both sides. And it's very simple to the bevel command, but what it does is keeps the original line there. So we can still just delete these lines and go back to where we had it. Another really important thing that a lot of people don't do is when you're going to do some big changes, you can just come in and copy your body and paste it with Control-C and Control-V and then just hide it, right? So now you've got a backup in case you do something completely crazy and destroy that. You can always come in and just show that. Obviously, Fusion has good autosaves and file control as well, but you know, that's just another option. Slide edge can be really good. So that allows us to push and pull this edge along its 0 to 1 sort of scale. So we can see that's where it's starting over here. And we can push it all the way in, and that'll give it a really tight little radius there. Or what we can do is slide it further away, and that's going to blend it in a lot better. So that can be really good for when you're playing around with shapes and trying to get the right transition from one surface to another. We then have the smooth command, and that generally just smooths out anything that's super wonky. So let's just go edit, and we'll grab a bunch of faces and points and things and make it really janky and weird. So obviously this is what we're trying to avoid. We don't want anything like this at all because it's way too hard to modify. So if we come into smooth, we have to actually pick the individual faces. There can be ways of just dragging over it and it selects everything, which can be useful too. And as I increase this, it'll smooth it out significantly to the point where, you know, the transitions are nice again. This can be really useful when you've got a slightly obscure face where it's kind of awkward to select all these different faces and stuff and try and smooth it out. But the smooth command can work really well for just kind of bringing it back to normal. other than that, we've got Flatten, which can help. Again, same sort of thing. You pick a bunch of points and it'll try and find the best sort of plane to flatten them on. This can be good. So if you're selecting a bunch of points on an area, it's going to go ahead and try and flatten all of these points out. Can be useful. I generally tend to just avoid it and make my surfaces flat to start with, just because right now that's the computer and Fusion figuring out how it should flatten it, whereas I much prefer figuring it out myself and just ensuring that it's flat as we go. Straighten can be really useful. So right now this has a dip in it. If we just go through and click a bunch of points, what it's going to do is straighten them out, and it does look sort of weird. Okay, so there I've picked something from down here which I shouldn't have picked. But it goes and it actually straightens them out in the box mode. So it doesn't, you can try and straighten it as surface points. I would not. I would straighten out the box mode, and you might find that you have to run it again because the line next to it is really wonky too. Sometimes you want to select the end tangency as well, but that shouldn't be a problem that often to straighten out like that. And now we can see that this transition is a lot smoother than it was because it's made these two lines straight. So if we have a look at how it was all wonky, and then it straightened it out. So the straighten command is really useful. Match, never use it. Interpolate, locate the surface and the control points to improve fitting. I've never used this command. That's just weird. I wouldn't use that either. Yeah, and then you can thicken. For our purposes in advanced CAD, we've looked at thickening things, so you can get the bottom surface to do different things to the top surface. In a lot of cases, we just want to thicken it once we're out of freeform. We can just create a thicken from here. And that gives us a lot more control of the shape later. It just really depends on the outcome. If you're doing advanced CAD stuff, obviously we use the thicken command on the sunglasses and all that. You can put in the different kinds of symmetry and utilities, repair body, make uniform. There is this thing of making the body uniform. Sometimes it does stuff, sometimes it doesn't. So if we go back and forwards, we can see it slightly adjusts some of these, ever so slightly, just to make the lines more uniform without changing the contours of the shape. It can be useful, but it doesn't have a huge amount of change. Maybe you just want to run that command, every 20 minutes when you're doing your shapes, and it'll just straighten things up again that you might have missed. But yeah, really, that's, I guess, what I would say is a basic introduction to some of these methods. It did drag on for a bit, but yeah, there is quite a lot here. And the one takeaway that you could probably have, if I could have you take away one thing, is to get your shapes as simple as possible with the least amount of faces, and have creased edges, have it all controlled, and then start to add in your detailing later. So like we showed with the very first type of box, right? It's about getting it, you can make the inside as complicated as you want now, but you don't need that. You just want to go in, crease the edges you want. So if we're just going to separate the top completely from the bottom here, if it'll allow us. Okay, so, we do that, and then we add in our contours and our things that make the shape really cool and freeformy. So then we pull in these sections, or pull out this section, or do whatever. Because when it's rounded, it's very hard to understand what exactly it's doing. And it's a lot better to control it simply and then get into the more advanced stuff. There's a process. Unfortunately, there's no timeline captured here. for all these little modifications, so you got to do it pretty smart. Copying the body will help you sort of make little backup points as you go along. But yeah, just keep it simple, add detail as you go. It's better to have something that has less detail and more control than something that's got heaps of little contours and stuff, but it looks like a wiggly mess thing. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is on like basic freeform stuff. Might do another video on some more complex features, but really that can be something for you to figure out as well. Thanks.